Today's webinar. I'm Vicki Osman with ABA. Thank you for participating in today's ABA webinar event, Women in Buses, Identifying the Important Players in the Motorcoach and Group Travel Industry and Their Key Acronyms, presented by Suzanne Rohde, Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy at ABA. Please stay tuned for a moment as we allow for others to join the webinar. Hello again, this is Vicki Osman with ABA. Welcome to the ABA webinar event, Women in Buses, Identifying the Important Players in the Motorcoach and Group Travel Industry and Their Key Acronyms, presented by Suzanne Rohde, Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy at ABA. Due to the number of people participating on today's webinar, all participants will be initially placed into a listen-only mode until the question and answer portion at the end of today's presentation, when we will open up your lines for questions. If you would like to make a comment, ask a burning question, or if you have a problem viewing or hearing the presentation at any time during the presentation, please utilize either the chat or question function on your webinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. I will convey your question to our presenters as soon as practical. During the Q&A segment, we ask that you click on the little hand icon located under the Attendance tab to indicate that you would like to ask a question. I will announce your name and you can begin speaking. But first, let me welcome Mary Young from Capital Bus Tours and the Chairman of Women in Buses Council to introduce today's presenter. Mary?
Thank you, Vicki. I am thrilled to be able to introduce Suzanne Rohde. She joined ABA in April of 2015, and she has an extensive public service career in the field of transportation, engaging in the development and implementation of policy, legislation, and regulation, as well as managing important transportation legal matters. She has held several senior positions in both legislative and executive branches of the federal government, serving 2 secretaries of transportation, members of Congress, and a member of the National Transportation Safety Board. She's held positions in the private sector as well, in the transportation consulting law firms in law and in the transportation industry. She has successfully engaged in government and industry representatives, building partnerships and coalitions to advance a number of transportation safety and economic initiatives. She has her Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Michigan in political science, with emphasis in business, and her Juris Doctorate from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and attended Johns Hopkins University for continued studies. Now, she did want me to share with everybody that with her extensive education, this is her 2nd webinar in her career, so please bear with her. Thank you, Suzanne, and welcome.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that very, very kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us today and the opportunity to talk to you all. I haven't had that opportunity yet, so I really welcome this chance when it was offered to me. So good afternoon, everyone. And I was asked to talk about acronyms. And so I was thinking about acronyms and all the times I've had to, between changing different modes of transportation and different environments, and a whole new world of acronyms every time. So I think this is a great topic to cover. So let's get started here. And as Mary pointed out, I'm a novice driving my webinar slides, so please bear with me. So this first slide, I just thought sort of captured how I have felt changing different careers and things like that when I'm in a room and people are talking about in their lingo. Miss London is the translator for the acronym and jargon. So to start with, I thought it might be useful just to look at the word acronym itself. And it's a word formed from the initial letter or letters of each of the successive parts or major parts of a compound term. So people look at, particularly in our world, in government speak, and we hear or see 3 letters, and we automatically assume that that's an acronym, when actually the technical definition means when you have those letters that are put together and they actually form what later becomes a word accepted in the dictionary, like radar. Radar was an acronym because it actually stood for radio detection and ranging, but it has become radar. Everyone knows what it is. Or scuba is another good example. So particularly in the government world, it's like moving into a whole new foreign language. And there are lots of acronyms or initials that are used to short form things because there's so many long involved titles or names of programs or even legislation for that matter. So when you move into the government world or you're working in that world and it's not your first primary source of business, it's like going into a foreign country, and we have German and Spanish and French, and then we have government. It's a whole new kind of speak that you have to sort of pick up on in order to navigate it. So going back to our little cartoon here, I'm hoping that I can provide some benefit in playing a role of Miss London today for this webinar and walk you through kind of from my world where government speak is my primary area and language, and see if I can try to help you or facilitate understanding on some of the things that I work on that I then turn around and try to explain to folks, members of the association. So a little quick civics lesson here. This probably looks familiar, but in our federal government we have 3 branches. We have the executive branch, which implements the law, and we have the legislative branch, obviously, that makes the laws, and the judicial branch, which interprets the laws. But today we're only going to focus on the executive branch and the legislative branch with regard to acronyms, because we don't really use too many of the judicial branch acronyms in our line of work here. So starting with the legislative branch, we have the U.S. Senate, and we have the U.S. House of Representatives, and together they basically develop all the laws, and so doing, then the President signs off of them, and that's when we actually have, when the bills become actual laws. So starting with the legislative branch, just talking a little bit about how they work, both the House and the Senate develop legislation through committees. So you have the large body of, I think it's 435, well, total 435 legislators, but 300 plus in the House, and then 100 in the Senate. Those are your elected officials. But they don't just sit in their own offices and draft legislation. They work through committees. There's different committees for different jurisdictions, areas of jurisdiction. So like we have the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, we have the Energy Committee, or we have an Appropriations Committee, or the Health. And then each of these committees, in turn, and they are made up of members of Congress, and they have a chairman, and they have their own staff, too, separate and apart from a member's office. They break down into subcommittees, so even the jurisdiction gets down to that narrow point. So you might have the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, but you have one that's just on highways and transit. You have another subcommittee that's on public buildings and things. So it all works through a committee process, and it's like peeling an onion. We'll keep going down each layer. So to talk about, on the Senate side, I'll start with, we're going to talk about a few of the key acronyms for our industry on the Senate side. And we're going to talk about the authorizing committees. These are the committees that have the types of jurisdiction like transportation or like energy, as opposed to an appropriations committee, which deals only with funding. These committees are committees that deal with policy, dictate regulations that are supposed to be promulgated, or deal with a highway trust fund to fund grant programs and things of that nature. So first, one of the first committees on the Senate side that's important for our industry is the Commerce Committee. And its full name is the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And it has a number of subcommittees, but the main committee, the full committee, is called the Commerce Committee. And then we have the EPW Committee, which basically stands for the Committee on Environment and Public Works. So the Commerce Committee is the committee that basically, in the Senate, that drafts legislation dealing with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. It also deals with legislation from the Federal Aviation Administration and the Federal Railroad Administration. They all fall under Commerce. But with regard to the Highway Administration, dealing with the funding that goes in the grant programs and the Highway Trust Fund, that comes out of the Committee on Environment and Public Works. So Commerce and EPW are our main committees that we worked with in order to, when we had the FAST Act, our reauthorization legislation passed last December. So it was these two committees primarily on the Senate side who put that together. And then there's another one just for interest, the HELP Committee, which is the Committee on Health, Labor, Education, and Pensions. And this committee is important on the Senate side for us, dealing with labor issues. We right now have an exemption under the Fair Labor Standards Act in terms of an exemption from having to pay overtime compensation for motorcoach drivers. And if, there's lots of discussion and threats about changing that, and so this would be one committee that might be involved in that as well. On the House side, our key committees happen to be, and again, these are authorizing committees only. These deal with the subject matter jurisdiction. So the primary one on here for us is the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, or T&I, as we casually refer to it. And not always between House and Senate do the committees line up. So the T&I committee has Federal Motor Carrier Safety, but it also has Federal Highway, whereas on the Senate side that was split into two separate committees. But T&I also has Rail, but what they don't have is they don't have jurisdiction over NHTSA, which would be the agency that deals with motor coach design. So that, on the House side, falls under the Energy and Commerce Committee. So between the House and the Senate, the committees, again, they don't always line up jurisdiction-wise. Not everything that the House has under the T&I committee falls under the Commerce Committee. So they manage them a little differently between the two bodies, which makes it interesting when you're putting legislation together, because you might get it through the House side and you know who the players are over there, and then you go over the Senate and it may be split into different committee jurisdictions. So, but these are just some of the kind of short forms of how we refer to our committees. And then the Ways and Means Committee. I mentioned this one because we don't have a whole lot to do with this, but one thing we do enjoy in our industry is the ability to seek a refund for fuel taxes. And so the Ways and Means Committee is the committee that writes tax law, and that's all it does. It deals with the tax code. So now, as I said that there are separate committees on each side, there are also committees that do share the same jurisdiction. Both House and Senate have appropriations committees, and these are key committees because they do a bill every year. This is the committees that write the legislation that fund the government every year. So when we go into those times of year when you hear, oh, the government's going to shut down, it's because this committee, both the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, cannot seem to put the bill together or bills together because they break them up individually, and they can't move them out of the House and Senate to become a law. So they have an annual job as far as legislation that they work on, but it provides all the funding for all the departments and programs. You might authorize that funding under the other committees that we walked through, the T&I committee or the Commerce Committee, but to fund the programs, actually pay out the dollars every year, it needs to go through and get need to have an appropriations bill. So in the world of appropriations, the key appropriation bill that we're concerned with is the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and Related Agencies bill. This title is both the name of the subcommittee, because again, as I mentioned, there's the Appropriations Full Committee, but it's broken down into subcommittees, and so this is the title of the subcommittee that works on the funding bill that's most important to us. This funding bill provides the funding for Federal Motor Carrier Safety, for the NHTSA, for DOT, for Department of Transportation, all the, as well as the Department of Housing and Urban Development. But also, when they produce their legislation, it shares the same name with it. which is the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and Related Agencies legislation or bill. But for short, when you're in Washington or you're talking about it, you don't want to have to say that whole long name, so we say THUD, or I always say THUD, but THUD is what a lot of folks use too. So also in the appropriations world, as I mentioned, there's an individual bill that goes for sort of each area of jurisdiction. So THUD works in the transportation mode, but we also receive funds, say, from the Homeland Security world for our security grant funding. So that comes under a different appropriations bill, and that would be the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. It doesn't have as cute of a title as THUD or THUD, but that's another one. But in order for these things to actually pay out, each bill has to be passed by House and Senate and then signed by the President. But oftentimes, we don't get that to happen. One bill doesn't make it, or several bills don't make it. Like this year, both the House and the House has passed its bill out of committee, but they haven't passed it out of the floor of the House. On the Senate side, they've passed their bill. So the chances look like they were going to be good, but we've had a short congressional year with an election coming up and conventions. So it's a good likelihood that the THUD bill or THUD bill will not even make it into a freestanding bill that gets signed by the President. So when Congress cannot come to agreement on the appropriations bills, and they need to buy themselves some time, they do a continuing resolution, a CR. And that's basically just a short-term patch of funding that they put in place because the government's fiscal year ends on September 30th. And as you might note by the calendar, we're coming upon that soon. And we still have a number of appropriations bills that have not passed. So there's a very good likelihood this fall that between September 30th and come the end of the fiscal year, and to get us through the election cycle, that we will see a continuing resolution to keep the government funded until things pass and they can sit down and come to agreement again on the appropriations bills. And then the next one I want to mention is omnibus. So we have a continuing resolution that will give us short-term funding, but when we don't have each appropriations bill getting passed, if there's some bills that do get through, that's great, but then there's oftentimes quite a few that never make it, or none of them may never make it. So what eventually we run into, in order to get through the next year of funding, is they roll up the individual appropriations bills like THUD and the Homeland Security bill into one big major bill that they try to cut agreements on as far as funding levels, and that bill becomes known as an omnibus funding bill. And I think there's a good likelihood after we have a CR this fall and we have the elections, we will probably see, hopefully around December timeframe, some kind of omnibus bill agreed to. And that's what will be the longer term bill and set all the funding levels for next year. So those are kind of a quick run through of the committees and some of the acronyms that go along with them. But acronyms are also really prevalent in legislation, how we name bills. You may have heard some of these names before. These might look familiar. The DRIVE Act versus the FAST Act. The FAST Act was our surface reauthorization bill that passed last December. But before it became the FAST Act, we had different versions of the bill that were called the DRIVE Act. Well, Congress really likes to make these clever little titles of bills because it makes them easier to talk about later and to refer back to. And so initially we had the DRIVE Act when the surface bill was going forward. And so once they tried to make clever names, and they put these really auspicious type of titles onto the bill. So developing a reliable and innovative vision for the economy. Thus you get the DRIVE Act. But eventually what came into, signed into law was the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or the FAST Act. And so it's not unusual, and especially when it's going to be a major piece of legislation, they'll want it to be memorable. So they will try to figure out some acronym for it because it's easier to remember and talk about and stick to instead of some of the other titles of bills. It makes it more interesting. And they can build themes around it that way, and it's easier to kind of advocate for. So some other ones you may remember or have heard of is MAP 21. prior to the FAST Act, we had MAP 21. This was the Surface Reauthorization Act that was passed, I think it was 2012. And so it was a moving ahead for progress in the 21st century, or MAP 21 for short. And finally, another personal favorite of mine I just want to mention was before MAP 21, I think the last Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act was the Safety Lou, which, as you can see, is a safe, accountable, flexible, efficient Transportation Equity Act. And just to give you a little insight, so T was used for a long time for the reauthorization bills. We had ICE-T, and then we had T21, and then the chairman of the House Committee, Chairman Young from Alaska, wanted to name, he was working on the reauthorization bill, and he wanted to name it for his wife, and his wife's name was Lou. And so everybody were struggling to figure out some way to find a name or a way to put an acronym together to memorialize Lou in legislation. So this is Safety Lou, and a legacy for users, and that was for Chairman Young's wife from Alaska. Let's see, what else do I have? Oh, and then the final one I just want to point out, this isn't a specific piece of legislation, but USC or statute. That is what the USC stands for, the United States Federal Code. So it's where, once a bill becomes a law, it's where the law is encoded. So if you're a lawyer and you want to practice and you're waiting to see if someone broke the law and you want to look it up, you would look at the statute. You would look at the USC, the United States Federal Code, or United States Code, US Code. And another word for law is statute. So that's what we're referring to when we use those words. So now from the legislative branch, we're going to move over to the executive branch. And the executive branch, as I mentioned, that's in charge of implementing the laws. So once they've been enacted and signed by the president, most bills are not self-executing. In other words, they have to have some action taken by one of the departments. So the departments, cabinet departments, secretaries, the president's cabinet, those are all the secretaries that head up the different departments, and they're a part of the executive branch, and they are responsible for carrying out the laws once they're passed. And how do they carry out those laws usually? By issuing rules or regulations. So it's important to know some key executive branch acronyms. And for our area, as I mentioned, these are all the departments. We have DOT as the first one, the Department of Transportation. Another important one for us is the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. And EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And it's a little bit different because it doesn't have a D in front of its name, because initially when EPA was created, it wasn't on the level of being an actual department, a cabinet department. It didn't have a secretary. Now it has a secretary, but they still didn't put a D in front of it. And Labor, the Department of Labor, which is also a cabinet department. So just taking the U.S. Department of Transportation, because just like in the legislative branch, we're going to peel the onion back. Even though we may have all those departments, within the departments, the divisions are broken down to even more smaller bits in order to execute the legislation or the statutes or do oversight. So here we have the U.S. Department of Transportation. This is their new headquarters down on the Potomac, or Anacostia, excuse me, Anacostia River. And as you can see, you might recognize some of these acronyms. And I'm not even capturing all the divisions of the Department of Transportation, but these are the primary ones. So these agencies or administrations, you can refer to them either way, all fall under the heading of the Secretary of Department of Transportation. So we have the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, we have NHTSA, we have FTA, FHW, FAA. Well, what do all of those acronyms stand for? Oh, and by the way, each one of these agencies has its own authority delegated to it by the Secretary of Transportation to make rules and regulations, or they can issue guidance. They manage all kinds of grant programs, some more than others, and they conduct enforcement activities. So we have the U.S. Department of Transportation, and then underneath it we have the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. We have the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, which is, again, NHTSA basically does the vehicle design. FMCSA is operational oversight, safety and oversight. And we have FTA, the Federal Transit Administration. We have some grant programs under there, but we also deal with FTA in terms of charter service, in terms of if we have public transit agencies trying to get into the charter business, then we need to go to the FTA and work through them as far as enforcing the charter rule. And then we have FHWA or FHA, depending on your time frame here in Washington, you might know it as either one of these acronyms. But that's the Federal Highway Administration. And up until 1999, FMCSA didn't even exist. It was just a component of FHWA. But the greater minds thought that it needed to have safety, needed to have for motor coaches and motor carriers of property, needed to have its own freestanding agency. So they carved it out of FHWA, and that's where it became its freestanding division. And then we have the Federal Aviation Administration. All of these have their own leadership. They have their own head, an administrator. But then over all of them is the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. Here's another example, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And this department is a monster. I'm only picking up a couple of their divisions here because it's when they created the U.S. Department of Homeland Security following the 9/11 events, they took parts of other departments and they merged them all under Homeland Security. So it's really quite a large department with lots of different components, but these are the main ones for our purposes. And again, they have the ability to make rules and regulations and issue guidance, manage grant programs, and conduct enforcement activities. So the key acronyms here, we have TSA. See, a lot of folks just refer to TSA because it's transportation from our business. That's the main department, main component of DHS that we deal with. So we sometimes forget that it actually falls under a department. We think it's freestanding, but it doesn't. It falls under the Secretary of Homeland Security. And then we have FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. FEMA used to be a freestanding, not so much department, but a freestanding agency. But once DHS was created, FEMA moved in underneath that secretary. Then we have CBP, Customs and Border Protection. These are the folks that are responsible for minding the borders if you do trips into Canada or Mexico. So they are also under DHS. I think they used to be, I want to say they were under possibly Justice, the Department of Justice. Then we have the U.S. Coast Guard. It's another one that falls under Homeland Security. And it used to be under the Department of Transportation, but they dug it out and they put it over here. So there's a lot of moving pieces back and forth. So these are coming to kind of the end of my slides here. We talked about how we have the legislature, and they're responsible for doing legislation, drafting laws, and then the committees that develop them. Now we're in the executive branch, and they have to execute the laws. And the primary way they execute the laws is through rulemakings or making regulations. So it's important, and I talk about these things a lot. I know when I reach out to our folks, I solicit you all to file comments on regulations to be heard. It's our opportunity to it's the opportunity for the public to kind of directly participate in the making of rules when we participate in a rulemaking in the comment periods. So there's some key acronyms here to kind of keep in mind as well. It's the rulemaking process. OMB. What is OMB? OMB is an agency. It's the Office of Management and Budget. It's kind of the hidden arm in Washington, D.C. We know we have the Department of Transportation, and we know that that secretary answers right to the president. The Office of Management and Budget is a sub-office of the White House, basically. And they are responsible, or they take the responsibility for overseeing all the rulemaking for all the agencies. And they issue things that are called executive orders. That's what the president signs. And these executive orders only apply to the government agencies. So they have executive orders that say how a rulemaking has to go, such as it has to be cost beneficial. OMB, when you're making rules and you're in a department, you have to run all your materials up through OMB before you can finalize a rule. So they're actually pretty powerful in Washington, D.C., but not many people even know they exist if you're outside of this area or you're not, specifically engaged in the rulemaking process. But they have a lot of power. And we have NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. And these will come issued out from the departments or a specific agency within the departments, like Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And notices of proposed rulemaking are required by law. If an agency wants to, make a policy, make a rule, they have to put it out and give the public an opportunity to participate, read it, submit comments, get feedback on it. So how they go about doing that, and how many days they give you to comment, and those things of those natures, those are dictated by OMB. But with regard to actually having the requirement that they issue notices, that's under the law, federal law. You have an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Again, this is sort of a creature that was created by OMB. This was to give kind of an initial opportunity before they actually put a tangible proposal out for a rule. This can be more amorphous and vague. This can explain the idea that an agency is shooting for, or it can be just soliciting feedback in order to craft an actual rulemaking proposal. So these tend to be a little bit more vague, but again, they're an opportunity to weigh in and give comments, and they're important to pay attention to because they should be signaling a direction that an agency is moving in before they actually issue the notice of proposed rulemaking. And then you have the final rule. This comes out after there's been a notice of proposed rulemaking. You don't have to do an ANPRM, but you have to do an NPRM and take comments. And then the final rule, what an agency is supposed to be doing, is explaining why they chose to write the proposal into a final rule the way they did. And they have to explain and answer the comments that they received, and explain why they chose to do one thing or another thing. Once there is a final rule issued, that becomes the regulation. And then where do you keep all those regulations once they've been promulgated? In the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFRs. So once something has gone through this process of an NPRM, maybe an ANPRM, this would come first, but an NPRM definitely, and a final rule, then it's going to be codified or written within the Code of Federal Regulations. And so we all know that we have a whole set of those that govern all the bus operations out of FMCSA, and the FMCSA then relies on this, and this is what FMCSA is permitted to enforce. So I went through that rather quickly, and I hope I didn't go too quickly, but I wanted to ensure that I left enough time for questions too.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So we really appreciate that. So now we'll open up the floor for questions. We ask that you click the little hand icon under the Attendance tab on your webinar control panel to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. I will announce your name, and then you'll be able to begin speaking. So if you have a question, go ahead and click that.
Suzanne, I'm impressed. I don't know that I followed it all because it's just powerful. I did follow it. It's great. What my question is to sort of to focus it on our Motorcoach industry, and know FMCSA and some things have been going on recently with the lease interchange rule, and they're looking at maybe re-looking at that. And as well as state inspections, and who is in charge of those type of things? Is it FMCSA under the DOT? Those kind of things that might help us relate to one situation that can make sense to us that all this is put together.
Sure. Let me see if I can kind of flip back here a little bit. I'm going to go back here. I've got to go back through all my clickers here. So, right, we have FMCSA. And as I said, they made the rule. They went through, first of all, doing an NPRM, right? I want to say that was in 2013, I think it was. And they first put out their idea, right, of what they were shooting for. And then, they solicited comments on it. They didn't do a very good job with that, though, because they ended up not getting a lot of comments from our industry. Right? So
they did not. Right.
Right. And it was kind of how they drafted it. And it was a demonstration that they really didn't understand our industry very well. Some of the things that they could have done, and now they've since been doing on some of the more recent rulemakings is they could have done an ANPRM with some of those ideas, and they might have found out some more information to help frame a better NPRM, or they could have held listening sessions. We now have had FMCSA come to our marketplace, or UMA's had it at their event, where they hold listening sessions, right, and where you can go and weigh in and ask questions. But once they've issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, they are not allowed, we're not allowed to have conversations directly about it, because that would be considered ex parte. It's outside the process. You have to do written comments in, because you have to give everybody an opportunity to see what your thoughts are, or the questions you are asking. But the staff-wise, you can't just pick up the phone and talk to them about it anymore, because once it's in the formal rulemaking process, let's see if I can click ahead here a little bit.
And our lease interchange rule is in the formal rulemaking right now?
No, the lease interchange has already gone through the NPRM, and it's become a final rule.
That's what I thought.
So it's done. It's on the books, technically. But, and this is up to the agency's discretion, the agency said that even though it was effective and we put it on the books, we're not going to enforce it until January of 2017. And they have to give about, I think it's either 30 to 60 days after a rule is final and they publish it, a federal regulation. There's a certain period of time that Congress has an opportunity to step in and say, no, we don't like your rule. Or we can petition and say, we don't like your rule. Or we could go directly to court and we could file. What we did was we did proceed on a petition for reconsideration. We asked, and that's a formal thing within the rulemaking process. I didn't include it here because I thought we were just focusing on acronyms. But petition for reconsideration is asking FMCSA, because it's their rulemaking. The Department of Transportation can do rulemakings in its own name, but it's usually their individual divisions that do rulemaking. So this is an FMCSA rule.
Yeah,
we asked them to reconsider it. We asked them to reconsider that rule. So they themselves have then pushed off the date. So it's on the books, but they have voluntarily made their own statement that they are not going to enforce or require compliance yet.
Right. I guess I brought that up as something that's been very recent, and it is something that FMCSA enacted or legislated or whatever the probably
published.
Thank you. Published. So that's something that's current, because all these acronyms that do affect us in a daily. Yes. So I don't know if there are other questions or questions that other agencies we might need to be aware of something going on, or how they affect us directly.
Sure. Well, and right now with the lease interchange rule, we've kind of taken every opportunity to have it reconsidered. So we're not only in the rulemaking process, and because the rule is final, the agency could come and talk to us one-on-one, which is what we have done. But we've also gone to Capitol Hill because we're asking for help there. So we're also looking at the appropriations process, which we talked about earlier, as an opportunity to try to, it's not unusual when an agency produces a rule, if folks don't like it, they go to Capitol Hill and they say, don't let them fund it. And so you go to your annual appropriations bill and you have them write in their language that says, no funds shall be used for enforcement of, say, the lease and interchange rule.
Okay.
So that's one way to attack it.
Right, right.
Are there other questions?
And I probably should add also that this presentation will be put up on our website, but we're also going to put a glossary of a number of other acronyms that are regularly used, because I just couldn't cover all of them in one setting, but we're going to make them available, so you should be able to look at kind of a glossary of acronyms or initials.
And you'll be able to access that through the webinar archive section, as well as on the Women in Buses pages. It'll probably be up starting tomorrow. Any other questions? Okay. Mary, did you want to talk about our next kind of event?
Certainly.
For women in buses?
Thank you. Suzanne, thank you so much. I sort of chuckle when I hear a new acronym out there. So now I'll know I can email you and say, what's this one, Suzanne? Thank you so much for joining us and trying to explain it to us. We can go back and re-listen to some of this to try to make sense of it all for us. Thank you.
Absolutely.
We did want to just remind everybody that's on our webinar today that our next conference call will actually be on August the 25th. It's going to be a council-wide networking meeting, and we look forward to everybody participating on all of our committees getting together and sort of having a meeting with our phone calls prior, as well as something I want to remind everybody. We put on the Facebook page, Vicki was able to put this on the Facebook page about building our network and getting to know each other. We're trying to do our Women in Buses on Wednesdays on Facebook, and if you would please send in a little bio and a photograph of yourself so we can get to know each other. And when we come to our meetings, there are conference calls, we'll know who we're talking with. So I think it'll help all of us. Do you have anything else, Vicki?
No, but thank you both to Suzanne and Mary for this and for those who were on the call. We'll look forward to continuing the conversations in August, if not before. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vicki. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.